And we are on the air, and you are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. This week on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a very special interview with a man who has the right stuff, astronaut, adventurer, and Dr. Scott Parazynski, the author of The Sky Below, a true story of summits, space, and speed. And in our second half hour, a conversation with New York Times science editor Jeffrey Kluger, the author of the wonderful book that tells the inside story of one of NASA's most daring missions, Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. An astronaut and a trip to the moon. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne podcast. Let's get to it. In his new memoir, The Sky Below, a true story of summits, space, and speed, astronaut, adventurer, and doctor Scott Parazynski takes us on a rocket ship-paced adrenaline-filled adventure from the dizzying heights of Mount Everest, where the wind whipped climbers to their death, to the solitude and expanse of outer space, where he was tethered to the International Space Station by an improvised leash to make emergency repairs. While his father worked as a Boeing engineer developing the Saturn V rocket, as a young boy, Parazynski traveled the world with his parents, living and attending school in places like Lebanon, Iran, and Greece. Scott, at an early age, cultivated a passion for exploration, but hid his desire to become an astronaut. He returned stateside for college and medical school, and while he was in residency at Denver General Hospital, the opportunity to fulfill his secret dream came true. In The Sky Below, Parazynski gives readers a front-row seat to his 17-year career at NASA, his training, leading the first-ever U.S.-Russian spacewalk, and taking us inside the family escort role he as an astronaut solemnly performed when disaster struck Columbia. The climax of his space career comes with a mission that many regard as one of the most dangerous and challenging ever performed. Let's talk.
Okay, so nice to have you here. Let's just get right to it because I've got 1,000 questions to ask you. Not enough.
Sure.
Listen to me. Doctor, astronaut, 5 missions to space, 7 spacewalks, hit Everest, coached luge in the '88 Calgary Olympic Winter Games, John Glenn's personal mission position, and now you're at the forefront of the future, developing new technologies in the medical and commercial space flight industries. So, Scott, listen to me. Is that blood running through your veins or some supercharged element? You're amazing. What drives you?
Oh, not really. No, I just see life as a great adventure, and like to pursue challenge wherever I can find it. So I've been very fortunate to have great support from family and friends, and quite honestly, to be born at the right time, where the United States was doing incredible things in space and medicine, and I hope we'll continue to do so long into the future.
But listen to me, you're being too humble. You are such an accomplished individual. No, you are, and we have to give you credit for that. I mean, we always talk about the right stuff, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But really and truly, yours is a life extraordinarily well lived. What motivates you?
Well, I think curiosity is probably at my core what drives me. As a physician, I always am thinking about, well, are there ways to do things better? Can we improve outcomes, reduce pain and suffering, make things more cost-effective, or what have you? That's kind of my inventor's hat that I wear at all times. But I'm always kind of wondering, are there ways in which we can do better for others? And so that has led me to go into some extreme environments. I think they're incredible catalysts for innovation. Anytime we send humans into space or to the top of the world or to Antarctica or beneath our oceans, you have to think in a different way. To sustain life there, you've got to invent new technologies to make it possible. And when you do so, oftentimes there are great byproducts, things that will help people here on regular planet Earth. And that really gets me excited. what wakes me up in the middle of the night.
You know what fascinates me about you? So many people who are scientists, eggheads, not well-rounded, singularly focused. You're like the master of it all. That fascinates me. No, seriously, that's why I loved your book so much. I felt like this is like a normal guy. We tend to think of God as being that way, and I have to give it to you. I love the title, by the way, The Sky Below. Is there something you want to say about
Thank you.
Title?
Well, yeah, so my book is about different perspectives on life. And so, I've had the perspective of looking at the sky below from space and also from the top of Everest. But even looking down into our oceans, you can think of that as a metaphorical sky. So there's so many mysteries there in all these different environments that can inspire us and lead us to new discoveries. But I would say that just to kind of follow on what you just said there, I guess I'm also a master of none, but one of the things that I really loved about being an astronaut is just that every day was a learning experience. We would have to operate and master different fields of science and engineering and technology to do the missions that we did, and I just love that process of learning new things. And that's what I think the space program gives us is great new discoveries that have their core basic science value, but then they also have additional unforeseen benefits to society.
I thought that the book was incredibly interesting for the fact that you really revealed your own thought processes, and that was amazing. You don't often read books where people are that open about it, including how you mastered some of the science that you had to learn and how your mind works. Everybody needs to pick this book up just to figure that out, because it's a lesson in mind training that we don't always get.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do talk a lot about pre-visualization, preparing for success, but also having a plan B and a plan C in case things don't go well. The other thing that I wanted to just give a shout out to my incredible collaborative writer, Susie Flory, who really challenged me as I was writing this book and as we're putting it together to go the extra layer or two of openness and honesty. I really wanted to share the human experience of these amazing places, but also the failures along the way. It's we oftentimes look at really successful people and think, oh, they just had it easy. Isn't their life remarkable? Well, I imagine all the people that we look up to had a lot of failure along the way as well. They just don't admit that they had to overcome those failures. And so I've had a charmed life. I'm really appreciative of the things that have come my way, but I've also had to work really hard and overcome some failures and some really serious health issues even. And I wanted to share that. And Susie really drove that home. She could be a psychiatrist in another career, I think.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's no small part of the book, because there were a lot of sacrifices that you had to make along the way. There was a failed marriage. You have a child with autism. You had a stroke. My God, right. That's a bizarre story. You didn't get to Everest the first time because of a bad back that you tried to get up there. And here's the thing about it, though. The story is, yes, but why are you different than us mere mortals? You kept going. You kept overriding. What's that about?
Well, I'm very much a mere mortal. I have to be very truthful on that, but I think I do have a special resilience and a passion for life that has really taken me a long way. And I would actually draw back to one of the lessons I learned from Boy Scouts of all places. I ended up becoming an Eagle Scout, and that's not, that's neither here nor there, I suppose. But it's a very long pathway to become an Eagle Scout, and it can be really daunting when we look at a lofty goal that we have or a big dream, and it's easy to say, well, I can't ever get there. It's too hard. But what I learned through the Boy Scouts is if you can actually break apart a goal into manageable piece parts and look at it as one merit badge at a time, or on a mountain, one rope length at a time, and kind of allow yourself to enjoy those rewards along the way, then it's not as intimidating. And so I guess the one skill that I've developed is is kind of figuring out ways to navigate the long, arduous path to where I want to go.
So let me ask you this. This is an interesting question. To achieve the kind of success that you've achieved, to become an astronaut, is there a certain selfishness to the service of your uniqueness? I don't ask that to be a wise guy, but I would think there would have to be to some degree.
Yeah, and I do talk about some of that quite candidly. I think I am wired a little bit differently. My passion for exploration and challenge, has been with me since probably I was in diapers, and so I think certainly the families of astronauts sacrifice a great deal, perhaps even more than the astronauts themselves. We explore because we're driven to do it, and we serve our country. But I think the families, they don't ever get a chance to really enjoy the experience of spaceflight. They're at home waiting and worrying about you, and those are incredible stressors on our families. And so I think I describe some of those challenges, existential challenges, in my book.
Yeah, and do it well, by the way. So let me go back to this. Let's go back to the right stuff. Love the right stuff. But beyond the PR of all of that, right? What makes you uniquely attracted to space when others are not? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, I think many kids, even today, are really excited about space, or have other big, lofty dreams that they'd like to pursue. But what happens, I think, through time and evolution and just plain growing up, is they get distracted by other things and kind of lose sight of that goal. I just never grew out of it, I suppose. But I think space is as exciting today as it ever was. And in fact, I'm really thrilled about this new commercial human spaceflight industry. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, all of which are American companies, by the way, leading this charge. And they'll be opening up the heavens for many more people to experience spaceflight, whether they're engineers or scientists or even just tourists wanting to go, experience a few minutes in weightlessness and see their planet from that vantage point. So I think it's a really exciting time to be alive for people of many different walks of life, not just geeks and nerds like me, but people, artists and dreamers to get a chance to see what I've seen, and maybe even one day we'll send politicians up there and we'll be able to solve world problems.
I'd like to see that happen. Maybe they get a better perspective of the real reality of Earth. They seem to be lacking these days. Listen to me.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we all can. I have to bring up John Glenn. I've written two fan letters in my entire life, Scott. One was to Alan Shepard, and one was to John Glenn, who I was lucky enough to get to meet. One word on him. That must have been extraordinary to spend time with that man. Talk to me.
I could spend hours telling you about John Glenn and extolling his many, many virtues. He's one of the greatest Americans of our time, and to get a chance to rub shoulders with him in outer space, that's as cool as it gets. I was just so thrilled to be asked to serve as his personal physician when he came back to space at age 77, and knew him not only as a crewmate, but as a close personal friend, and just revered the man. I did as a young boy, and think even more of him now today. He was a role model for me as a young man, but he became a role model for senior citizens. People can live these extraordinary lives even into their 70s and 80s, just by perseverance and so on.
I want to talk to you about fear very quickly, because I think fear is just part of who you must be. Fearful moments, fear that makes you different than we mere mortals. I don't know if I could sit at the top of a rocket and blast it off into space. Maybe. I don't know. But I'm curious about that fear thing. Is it your goal? Are you a thrill seeker? Outwit fear? Embrace fear? Ride the fear? What's the choice here? Is it D, all of the above?
Interesting question, and I guess I probably take a different tact on it. I am a risk manager rather than a risk taker, so I don't. I would never do anything where I didn't feel like I had some degree of control and understanding and training to master what's going on around me. Granted, when you're sitting on 7 million pounds of thrust to leave the planet, there are certain things that you're hoping everybody bolted the ship back together with the right torques and everything is going to work perfectly that day. But when you're in that environment, you get into the zone and you're focused on all those things that you can control. And if it's something that's out of your control, it's really not something that's going to be constructive or helpful in allowing you to complete your mission. And so, the same thing for being on the side of Mount Everest. There are a lot of things that you can do to reduce your risk by being in, absolute best physical condition, by working with the best teams, having the best equipment, knowing the weather forecasts, and many other factors. You can't control the occurrence of an avalanche, for example, but you can minimize your exposure to them by climbing in the middle of the night when the sun isn't warming the ice and making them looser and more likely to release. So that's kind of how I approach risk. There are times that I have felt afraid, but perhaps not in the same way that you might. When I was doing the solar array repair on my final mission in space there, I wasn't nearly as concerned about my own physical safety as I was worried that I wouldn't be able to complete the job that I was set out to go do. I didn't want to let the team down.
At the end of the day, you've seen it all, buddy, literally and poetically. You've been to the mountain, and you've seen it from the top, and you've seen it below. What really matters in the scheme of it all?
What really matters is the team. First and foremost, there's no solitary, great achievement in all of humanity. It's working together with great people doing great things. And so I was so charmed and blessed to be able to work on the NASA team for 17 years and with a mission that's larger than life. And I hope to be able to continue to contribute to society in different ways through what I'm doing now.
Scott Parazynski was inducted into the Astronaut Hall of Fame in 2016 and is the recipient of many prestigious awards, including 5 NASA Spaceflight Medals, 2 NASA Distinguished Service Medals, 2 NASA Exceptional Service Medals, the Aviation Week Laureate Award, the Antarctica Service Medal, the National Eagle Scout Association's Outstanding Eagle Award, and a Lowell Thomas Award from the Explorers Club. Now a tech startup CEO and a prolific inventor, he ventures into some of the world's most extreme environments in the name of exploration and innovation. I've been speaking with astronaut Dr. Scott Parazynski. His book, The Sky Below. For more information on Dr. Parazynski and his work, visit Parazynski.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne podcast. My guests today are astronaut Dr. Scott Parazynski, author of The Sky Below, a true story of summits, space, and speed, and Jeffrey Kluger, author of Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne podcast, nearly 300 episodes available at hallicasserjayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. Share the link to the show with your friends or my show's player. And I would love it even more if you'd recommend they visit my website at hallicasserjayne.com. I look forward to seeing all of you there. The story of Apollo 8 begins in August 1968. NASA was losing the space race with Russia, with earliest estimates of going to the moon still more than 2 years in the future, and President Kennedy's promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade was sure to be broken. The United States was deep into the Cold War, and in the middle of a year of violence abroad and at home. from Vietnam through Cambodia, Southeast Asia, was in flames. The Soviet Union had just invaded Prague, crushing a tentative democracy movement. Both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, and dozens of cities across the country had been convulsed by race riots during the summer, with the Democratic Convention in Chicago similarly descending into violence. And so it was that in the midst of all of that turmoil, NASA scrapped their meticulous mission schedules and asked 3 brave men to orbit the moon. And they would do it in just 4 months. The risks were substantial. The astronauts were flying a spacecraft that had killed a 3-man crew in a launch pad fire just a year earlier. The rocket was unproven and had failed its most recent test flight, and they were facing an abbreviated training period for the unprecedented journey. But despite the huge risks involved, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders signed on to the Apollo 8 mission, equal parts fearless and reckless, ingenious and impulsive. A calculated risk and a wild crapshoot, the story told in Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon, written by Jeffrey Kluger, a science editor and a senior writer for Time for more than 2 decades, and Jim Lovell's co-author on their best-selling book Apollo 13, on which the beloved film is based. Jeffrey Kluger is my guest for the half hour. Let's talk. Listen, this book couldn't come at a better time, I have to tell you. We need heroes. We're desperate for heroes.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. Someone else mentioned that today, and it was the first time I had thought about it that way, and I thought, well, yeah, if Apollo 8 came at a time we needed it, I mean, the mission, maybe the Apollo 8 book will help a little bit, too, in some small way. I hope so. We really do have to remember.
I was going to say, absolutely. Listen, I want to begin with the astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. It's hard to believe these guys are in their 80s. 2 of them are pushing 90.
I know.
What? Where did the time fly, right?
They are. And the thing is, I mean, some of this says something about how brilliantly NASA selected its astronauts. If you pick 15, 20 random 38-year-old men in the 1960s and say, okay, let's flash forward 50 years, how many of them are still going to be around? How many of them are still going to be able to fly their own private planes? You'd say, maybe 2, maybe 1. Well, so many of them have survived this long because NASA selected for calm and for resolve and for even-keeled temperaments and just guys who love to work and love to be alive. And that's what I've found in talking to all of them.
Can I just tell you one thing off topic? Your voice is mesmerizing me. I love your voice. You need to be on radio.
Thank you so much.
What can I tell you?
Well, it's very sweet of you to say that. I will tell you a self-humbling story about that. I asked my ear, nose, and throat doctor about 5 years ago. I said, I noticed my voice has gotten a little bit deeper. Do you know why? And I thought she was going to say, well, it's some later life surge of testosterone. And she said, yeah, it's mucus. It's just mucus on your vocal cords. And I said, all right, well, then don't give me an expectorant. Because...
That's funny. Well, if that's what it takes, I need to get some. Listen to me.
Exactly.
Right? When you talk to these guys, I've just got to ask you, I mean, is hero all over their bodies, and do they wear it well? Being in their presence, they are 3 very unique men.
Indeed they are, and of course it's not just these 3 guys. I mean, they were the first human beings to go to another world, so they're pretty extraordinary. But I've met a lot of astronauts, and I've met a lot of lunar astronauts, and I can't think of one who doesn't wear it well. I can't think of one who doesn't carry what they did with a certain amount of grace, with a certain amount of humility, more than a certain amount, really, with a certain amount of appreciation for having been given the opportunity to do what they did. They realize, of course, look, I mean, Lindbergh or the Wright brothers could build their own plane and fly it. Lindbergh needed to be financed, yes, but the Wright brothers didn't need anybody. They just got a little space on the beach, built a plane, and flew it. In order to be among the first people to travel to another world, you have to be selected, you have to be trained, the mission has to be bankrolled, you have to be put in a position to make history. And all of these guys spoke of themselves as nothing more than the tip of the spear. And in the case of a rocket, it was almost literally that, this, pointed thing with 3 people at the top. But beneath them were 400,000 other people who worked in the Apollo program, all the way from the guys in the rocket to the people on the factory floors, in the subcontractors all over the country. And they realized that they were working for those people, with those people, and were also the beneficiaries of the work those people were doing. And I think they still carry it with them today.
I think that's an important point and a good point to raise, because it's never just 3. It's the world, right? To
Right.
pull off something like this. I want to talk about pulling it off. I mean, I set the stage in the intro, which you didn't hear, as to what, how this all came about so quickly, and they were going to take 4 months to pull it together. Oh my God! I mean,
Exactly.
You got to be nuts to just to even think about that. But I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you some of the discussions that led to that decision to do it in 4 months. I mean, must have been something interesting to peek into in your research.
Well, indeed. And as much as I enjoyed researching what happened in the factories and in the spacecraft and in the vicinity of the moon, what surprised me was how fascinating it was to do the research about what went on in the offices in NASA when they made the decision to do this. Remember, NASA had become very risk-averse by the summer of 1968. They had lost 3 men in the Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967. They were not about to risk three other men on a mission that was considered too dangerous or premature or just an exercise in hubris. So they were willing to miss that John Kennedy deadline to get men on the moon before the end of the 60s, if it meant making sure that when they did get there, they got there alive. And yet, in the summer of 1968, in August, 16 months before Kennedy's deadline ended, George Low, one of the top administrators of NASA, called Chris Kraft and Bob Gilruth into his office and said, look, our Apollo spacecraft, effectively, he said, the Apollo doesn't work. The Saturn V doesn't work. The LEM is hopeless. We're not even close to being able to perfect the machine that's going to land on the lunar surface. But if we're smart, and if we work fast and we work hard, we can fix the Apollo spacecraft. We can get it flight ready. We can fix the Saturn V. We can get it flight ready. And we can kickstart our program by getting 3 guys into lunar orbit by the end of this year, and the launch window being what launch windows being what they were, and the physics of the Earth and the Moon being what they are. It actually turned out to be Christmas week, which was extraordinary. And Kraft and Gilruth effectively said what every other person who was first presented with that idea said, which was, you cannot do that. It's too risky. It's premature. We've seen what happened. And then they started to talk it through, and they thought, well, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can accelerate here. Maybe we can crack down on quality control here and make sure this gets done. And bit by bit, they called people in and invited them to be part of the discussion. They called in a guy named Bob Ernle, who was the head of the computer systems in Houston, and said, can you get the programs ready by December? And he said, if you give me every computer in Buildings 12 and Building 30 at Mission Control and give me the entire weekend, I can tell you if it's possible. And he came back on Monday and said, yes, it's possible. They then flew out to Huntsville, Alabama, and buttonholed Werner von Braun and said, effectively, Werner, your Saturn V doesn't work. Can you fix it by December? And von Braun said, as long as I can get them off the ground and into space, at that point where you point them is fine. It doesn't matter. He said, yes, I can fix it. One piece at a time, the great levers of the moon machine came together. And the last important piece was the astronauts themselves. And that was up to Deke Slayton, who was one of the original 7 astronauts who knew his pilots in some ways better than they knew themselves. And he decided that the crew that was supposed to fly Apollo 9, which was Borman, Lovell, and Anders, should be bumped up. They should take 8, and they should fly that spacecraft to the moon. And they did it.
Did any of them, and I always think this about success, the minute you question anything, that's the end of it. You have to be forward-thinking, focus on where you're going, and say, nothing is going to stop me. Is that what happened, the mentality? This group, because it's a group, the 3 guys are in front, clearly, but as you said, it's a team effort. Did you get the sense that it was, we're just going to do what we have to do? That's it, and we'll do it.
Absolutely, and that's a really good question. And yes, there was a monomaniacal focus from all of them. The astronauts, remember, this happened in the summer of 1968. 1968, or the planning took place then. 1968 was the most horrible, was the bloodiest year in contemporary human history. There were the assassinations at home, the riots at home, the riot at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Tet Offensive. It was disaster after disaster in a blood-soaked year. And even with all of that, the guys in mission control and the astronauts, when you talk to them now, they say, look, we were patriots. We knew what was going on. We knew what our country was going through. But to us, it was all sort of a dull thumping. It was a flash behind a scrim. We were focused on the work we were doing. It's more than a metaphor that mission control is a windowless room. They could watch on TV what was going on. These guys, a lot of them had friends who were fighting in Vietnam. The astronauts themselves were fighter pilots, and their colleagues and their Naval Academy classmates were fighting in Vietnam. But they all focused on this one huge battle in the Cold War. You know, when I talked to Jim Lovell when we were writing Apollo 13, and I asked him, as so many people have, how he was able to maintain his cool in space, he said, it was like playing solitaire. As long as you have a card to turn over, you're still in the game. Until you are out of cards, you're still in the game.
Oh, so God, that's a great line.
Focus on that.
Yeah, that's a terrific line.
He said it really amused me because one of the reviews, Apollo 13, I'm happy to say the book got generally good reviews, but there was one review that said, well, we don't really learn enough about what's in the astronauts' heads. And Lovell looked at that and kind of laughed, and he said, what was in my head? Trying to go home was in my head. What do they mean? What was I feeling? I was trying to go home. That was it. He was just, I'm doing a job here. Don't bother me with details. It's really quite wonderful, the way they can compartmentalize.
Well, I'm going to decompartmentalize, because what were the odds of them returning successfully? Is that a number that was available?
That was a number that was available, but people crunch those numbers different ways. You know, in some way, it's always binary. You're either going to succeed or you're going to die. So, but that's sort of true of everything. In some ways, it's binary. You go out to work today, you're either going to come home fine or a building's going to fall on you. They obviously had a much harder job than just walking out in the street and hoping a building doesn't fall on you. Jim Lovell, in the center seat, really didn't consider the odds. When I talked to him about it, he said, it was a mission. We either were going to make it or we weren't going to make it. And he just loved flying in space. Jim was never quite so happy as when he was flying in space, and I frankly think he would go back today. Frank Borman, the commander, tried not to think about it also, but his wife, Susan, was determined to find out. And she buttonholed Chris Kraft, who was the director of flight crew operations. Kraft is still around. He's in his 90s also. He still is a wiry, frank, sandpapery, wonderfully profane man. I love talking to Chris Kraft. And she got him aside when he came to their house for a cocktail party once before the mission flew. And she said, Chris, I want you to tell me what the odds are of their making it back. And Chris said, you really mean that, don't you? Because often family members would say they wanted to know the odds, but they really just wanted reassurance. So he said, you really, really want to know that, don't you? And she said, yes, I do, and you know I do. And he said, fine, how's 50-50? And her answer was, I suspected as much. Bill Anders, who crunched the numbers on his own, he was the man in the right-hand seat and was an engineer, and he was pretty good at estimating the reliability of a spacecraft. He put the odds at 33, 33, 33. A one-third chance they would make it to the moon, they would get home, they would completely succeed. A one-third chance that they were going to come home alive, but they would not successfully make it to the moon. And a one-third chance they were going to die in the effort. And in anticipation of that, he made 2 audio recordings before he left the house to go to the moon. One was to be played for his 5 children. He had 5 small kids. For his 5 children on Christmas Eve, assuming everything was going well. And then one was to be played, as I say in the book, if there were no Christmas Eves to come.
Fascinating people made of some kind of character that a lot of us probably wouldn't have. And I wonder if you found something in each of them that they each got as kids that fortified them to be the steely yet warm characters that they and brilliant characters they became as adult human beings.
That's a really wonderful question. The two stories, I will admit that I know Frank's and Jim's, Borman's and Lovell's stories a little better than I know Anders, and I know them as individuals a little bit better. I think certainly all of them had stable, loving parents. In the case of Jim, grew up, his father died when Jim was relatively young in a car accident. He had a very supportive mother, however, so they all grew up with stable backgrounds. But in the case especially of Borman and Lovell, whether it was their circumstances that gave them their temperament or their temperament that built their circumstances, I think it's impossible to know. I know in both cases, both were incredibly tenacious people. Both of them applied to military academies. Borman went to West Point. Lovell went to Annapolis. Both of them got only a third alternate slot. In the case of Borman, amazingly, the long shot came through, and three other guys who had been accepted ahead of him passed on the chance, and he was in. In the case of Lovell's chance, the long shot didn't come through, and he instead entered a program called the Holloway program that would allow him to become a naval aviator and to enter the Navy as an officer, but it wasn't quite the same as going to Annapolis. And then later, a belated acceptance to Annapolis came through 2 years later, and he said, you know what, it's worth it to me to start my education all over if I'm going to be an Annapolis man. So both of them had a very sharply focused sense of what they wanted. Borman was grounded for a year before he ever got to fight in Korea, which is what he wanted to do, because of a burst eardrum while he was flying. He had to fight to return to flight status. Both of these guys just fought and fought and fought to get where they were going because they had exactly that kind of unflinching focus that we were describing earlier, and I think that worked for them.
And character counts. In the interest of time, December 21st, 1968 launch date, the flight's fraught with danger, filled with heart and soul and intrigue. Talk to me about the Soviets. So those Russians, they're back in the news. You reveal details of secret It's true, darling, right? It's like everything old is new again. You reveal great secrets and great details in this book about conversations inside the Soviet Central Research Building outside of Moscow as the mission was unfolding and the Apollo 8 broadcasts were beaming down from space. And I was alive, young, baby, just a child, but I remember it well. And I can only tell you, you think about those crackly, when we heard them coming in on those old radio that they used up there. I mean, oh my God, to go back. But talk to me about background stuff like that. I love the intrigue.
Well, and there actually is. There are records now that Soviet scientists finally wrote, and he compiled them into a 4-volume set of his recollections of what happened there. And it was pretty extraordinary. They had to, even in the Central Research Building, they had to pirate the signals from Eurovision because signals from the West could not make it through Soviet scrambling. They didn't want the people in the country to see what was going on in the West, and they couldn't see it in the research building either. Well, they were able to pirate a signal. It wasn't a great signal, and they were able to watch what was going on. The first thing they saw was the launch, and these guys were missile men. So on the one hand, they were in a foot race with the Americans. On the other hand, they all honored the missile man's credo, which is you never want anything to go wrong with another man's rocket, with another country's rocket. And yet when the Saturn V took off, and the first stage burned out and separated. If you've ever watched that footage, it actually looks like the rocket is exploding. There's a huge flare that consumes it, and then the flare dies, and you see the first stage fall away, and the second stage lights, and off the rocket goes. And the Soviet writer admitted that they all caught their breath and looked at one another with a guilty sense of, oh, good, we're still in this fight. And they all felt shame over that. And then the second stage lit, and they knew two things. They knew these guys didn't lose their rocket, these guys didn't die, but we have just lost this race. At the end of that first session, they were asked by the head of what was then what it was known as Roscosmos, the Russian NASA, come back Monday and tell me what we can do to catch the Americans now. Tell me what's possible. And they came back Monday and they said nothing. Nothing is possible.
I love it.
And they knew at that point that they had lost this race.
Yeah, pretty fascinating when you think about it, particularly as where we are today. Apollo 8 took 3 days to travel to the moon. It orbited 10 times over the course of 20 hours, during which the crew made a Christmas Eve television broadcast. Mr. Kluger, this is extraordinary to me. At that time, it was the most watched TV program ever. And what did they do? They broadcast the first 10 verses they read the first 10 books from the book of Genesis. Whose idea was that? What was that all? That was brilliant PR.
It was extraordinary PR, and it was the idea of a guy named Ron Layton, who had worked for the American Information Bureau or American Information Services, which, I mean, it's a government agency, and its job does essentially what it says, sell the American story to the world. And he did not know what in the world to give them to say. It was a guy, the head of public affairs, first came to Frank Borman before they ever left and said, hey, listen, you're going to have the largest audience in the world that has ever witnessed anything. We're estimating 1 billion people, which was 1 out of 3 people on the entire planet at the time. Figure out what you want to say. And Frank Borman said, well, what should I say? And he said, just do something appropriate. Well, that wasn't very helpful. So Ron Layton was assigned the job of doing this. And the story goes, and it has actually been confirmed, that he was staying up late. He stayed up late many nights, and he was in his kitchen late, 3 or 4 in the morning, with his manual typewriter in front of him, trying to write things for them to say. And his wife walked in the kitchen and said, I have it, Genesis. And he essentially said, yes, you do have it. That's exactly right. So they typed that up on fireproof paper, because after the Apollo 1 fire, nothing went into the spacecraft that was flammable. It was put in the back of the flight plan. For the first part of that broadcast, the astronauts gave a little travelogue impromptu of what they were seeing out of their window. And then they read Genesis. And they ended with Frank Borman saying, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we wish you good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Now, look, you could be a person of faith, you could be an atheist. If your heart didn't burst at that, you had no heart. I was a cynical adolescent watching that. Even I, who swore I would never shed tears because I was an adolescent boy, I missed it up at that. How could you not be moved by that?
Absolutely. Brilliant, and heartfelt. When they were on the far side of the moon, which sounds like a comic strip, they were out of radio contact with Earth. Share with us some of the details of the private conversations that they had. Just give me about a minute or 30 seconds of that, because I have a couple more questions and I'm watching that clock.
Sure. The thing that struck me the most was when they fired their engine to settle into lunar orbit, because in order to do that, they had to slow down. Well, when you're near another world, you don't want to slow down. If you slow down, you're going to get grabbed by gravity and you're going to crash into the surface. So they had to slow down just enough to be captured by gravity so that they could still orbit. They pointed the spacecraft backwards. They fired that engine. They knew that the engine was going to be 4.5 minutes. It was going to have to burn for 4.5 minutes, which is an awfully long time. And you hear them in the recordings. You hear them buckling into their seats. They light the engine. After a minute, one of them says, geez, just 1 minute so far? And then another minute unfolds, and you hear one of them say, this is the longest 4 minutes I have ever spent in my life. They count off until they get to 0, and then Lovell shuts the engine off, looks at the instrument panel, and he calls out 2 numbers, 160 by 169, and they whooped, because that meant they were in an elliptical orbit, 160 miles by 69 miles. It was exactly what NASA had told them they would get. It was exactly what the flight plan called for. They were the only people in all of humanity who knew they had succeeded. The rest of the world would not know until they had come back around the front again. Fascinating.
Borman got sick, right? He really suffered from space sickness.
Yes. Before, nearly all other American flights had been in the Mercury or Gemini spacecraft, and they were tiny. They were so small the astronauts could never get out of their seats. Well, if you can't get out of your seat, you don't really experience motion sickness. The Apollo spacecraft was much larger, so they could float out and move around. And the second they all got out of their seats, they realized this is a very different experience. Lovell experienced a little bit of time. His stomach sort of turned over. Anders did as well. But Borman got severely space sick for the first 12 hours they were in space, and there was a real risk they were going to have to abort the mission. Not so much because Borman couldn't have toughed it out. He was and remains a very gritty guy. He would have done what he had to do, but because nobody knew why they were sick. Nobody knew why Borman was suffering the way he was. And there were only two very bad answers that the surgeon could determine. Either he had a virus, which meant that the other two guys were definitely going to catch it because they were in a sealed spacecraft, or he had gotten sick by moving through the Van Allen radiation belts. Nobody had flown through the Van Allen belts before. And while on the one hand, they knew that the radiation you would absorb was little more than what you would get in a dental x-ray, on the other hand, given the time it took to get through it, it would be like a 7-hour dental x-ray. Well, that's not a good thing. So they were Dr. Chuck Berry, it was a wonderful name, who was the flight surgeon, was convinced that it was radiation sickness, and he recommended scrubbing the mission. They actually phoned that up to the astronauts and said, Dr. Berry says you should basically abort. And Borman actually laughed at that and refused and said, you're talking to grown-ups here. We can do this. Don't worry about us. And after about 12 hours, he got better.
I love that. I think that's such a great story. Now, I'm going to tease the audience, and I don't want you to answer this, but something did happen on Apollo 8 that you talk about in the book that leads to Jim Lovell, who, by the way, was the man who said, Houston, we've got a problem in Apollo 13, for those of the name sounds familiar, but you're not sure. But that Apollo 8, Jim Lovell might have never survived the disaster of Apollo 13 had he not learned something very important in Apollo 8. But you're not going to tell what that is right now. We're going to tell people, now you got to read this great book, right? Right. I'm a tease. I'm really bad.
Exactly, yes.
I'm a naughty.
I will not say a thing.
All right. So listen, Jeffrey, no one can doubt that the flight of Apollo 8 was groundbreaking. And there were accomplishments by the, oh my gosh, that still influence today. Can you name just a few?
For one thing, the Earthrise photo. That was taken when the crew was on their third orbit of the moon. They were arcing around from the far side. They had yet to see Earth from the moon, and suddenly they saw the blue-white glass sphere of Earth rising up over just the wrecked beach of the moon. Their breath caught. They went to take pictures, and Bill Anders, who was the mission photographer, realized he only had a black and white film magazine in his camera. He barked at Lovell, get me some color film. Lovell darted down to the lower equipment bay, got him color film. They shot off a bunch of pictures, and that picture became what was thought of as the image that animated the environmental program. Had there been no Earthrise picture, there may have been no environmental program, or at least not the way it began with the energy with which it began. Because for the first time, we were seeing what a rare thing a living world is. For the first time, we were seeing what life in the void of space looks like. And that reminded people that the Earth is destructible. I think the other part of the Apollo 8 legacy was that it allowed for Apollos 9 through 17 to happen. It allowed for the lunar landings, and it also allowed for people to see that we were capable of being a species of two worlds instead of a species of just one world. It allowed us to realize that you can come up with these crazy ideas that in 1961 President Kennedy can say, we're going to get to the moon in 8 years, when we had exactly 17 minutes of flight experience by then, Alan Shepard's suborbital flight in 1961, and we did it. It was a reminder that when the U.S. or any country chooses to do something extraordinary, they can do something extraordinary, and that, I think, is the enduring legacy of Apollo 8. Kennedy used the words, we choose to go to the moon, and we chose in 1968 to do it.
A good lesson for today, by the way. A good reminder. Wonderful book, Mr. Kluger, and great voice. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your time, and you ask great questions, and I could chat with you all day if we had the time.
We'll do it again sometime. I just want to hear the voice. Thank you, darling. I've been speaking with Jeffrey Kluger. His new book, Apollo 8, the thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. For more information on Mr. Kluger and his wonderful book, visit time.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of RESEC LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit hallicasserjayne.com.